Hello and welcome to the 7th episode of the Benko Gambit Speedrun series. In this video, we are taking a look at 3 different games that I have been playing against players in the rating range of 1300 to 1400 in the rapid rating pool on chess.com. In the 3 different games, we're going to be playing against opponents who make some errors in the opening. We punish them, in the first 2 games especially. I would say that probably the most interesting game of these 3, in my opinion, for this video is going to be the third one, where we do play into what's known as kind of a Spielmann-Indian. I don't explicitly name that opening during the game, but it is an opening where our opponent starts off with d4, plays knight f3, and they also do play the move pawn to d5 after we play the move c5. It gets into a little bit of a Benko Gambit flavor of things, so it's a little bit more, I would say, mainline compared to a lot of the other games that our opponents have been playing in the speedrun series so far. But I'm expecting as we continue the climb up the rating ladder, the openings are going to become a bit more mainline. If you are playing the Benko Gambit yourself, the games are going to become a bit more closer to that type of play as the speedrun continues. So the first 2 games are very nice. The third game has some actual theoretical value, I think. So hopefully you enjoy the 3 different games, and let's get right into them. All right, we got our first game here. Against d4, we're going for knight f6. We're playing against Abu Amina, 1966. They continue with e3 on move number 2. We are going to go for c5, striking at our opponent's center, and they go for the move c3. So they're playing probably what's going to become a bit of a Kali system type of setup, where they play d4, put the pawns on e3 and c3, put the bishop on d3. It's pretty close to a London system type of setup, except the main difference is the bishop stays on the c1 square and doesn't go to the f4 square, which is where the London, the bishop in the London system tends to go. So against this setup here, what I recommend is going for the move pawn to d5, and then I assume white will play bishop to d3. Oh, they played pawn to g3. So this is a bit of a weird move to me. Usually, what white will do is put the bishop on the d3 square, and then play stuff like knight f3, castle, and then try to play the move e4 later on down the road. That's usually the setup that white will go for in this Kali system kind of organization of things. But g3 is out of place, in my opinion. Here, white has made a ton of pawn moves, putting a lot of them, pretty much all of them, almost aside from the a2 pawn, on the dark squares, which means that they're going to have some light square weaknesses. All of these light squares are kind of like Swiss cheese in their position. That being said, there's not an obvious way for us to capitalize on or punish this, but the main issue that white's going to run into in this position, I think, in the long run, is they are behind on space in the center. And what I'm going to try to do at the right time is I'm going to work towards playing the move e5 in order to open up the position. So against the move bishop d3, what I recommend in my course is knight to d7, protecting the c5 pawn and then working towards e5 later. Against g3, I'm not really sure if we need to continue with knight d7, but I also don't really see a problem with it at the same time, quite honestly. The nice thing about the knight on d7 is it does cover the c5 pawn. If you go knight to c6, you always have to be a little bit careful about white taking the pawn on c5, and then you may or may not get it back. So here I am going to stick with the normal setup, quite honestly. I think white is going to have a kind of worse version of things than they normally will when they put the bishop on g2. And I'm still going to play g6 and bishop g7. This is the setup I generally recommend against the Kali system. And I don't think we need to veer from it in this particular scenario. So we're going to go g6, bishop g7, castle the king, and then the goal is to play the move pawn to e5 in the center of the board. So white's playing a solid way of developing their pieces, but a very passive way of developing at the same time. So I am going to go e5. Usually this is kind of the antidote to passive play, is to strike in the center of the board, gain more space, put pressure on the opponent, different things like that. So here white plays the move knight to b3. They are attacking the pawn on c5. I think I'm just going to go for b6. I have to be a little bit careful about this diagonal. Maybe they play something like pawn to c4, which could be a little bit tricky. Another option is to play queen to c7 just to guard the pawn, or queen to e7. Let's see here. I think I'll probably just go queen to e7. Or, sorry, queen to c7. I'm not... Queen e7 or c7. I think, actually, now that I'm saying, I think I'm going to go to e7. Stay a little bit closer to the center of the board is what I'm thinking. Yeah, let's go for this one. It is possible for white to take the pawn. We recapture. They could take the pawn on d5. It would be very risky to do this, because losing their light square bishop would mean that their entire kingside castle protection is pretty much gone. Okay, they go for the move rook to e1. They are lining up towards our queen, but there's a lot of things in the way, so I don't think I'm too concerned about that right now. I think I'm going to go for the move rook to d8, just to line up with their queen. And this is also going to protect my pawn on d5 a little bit extra. So they go pawn to f3. I'm not really so sure what the game plan there is. I think now I'll go pawn to b6, and I'll put the bishop on b7. And I'm not really in a rush to make any of these pawn captures just yet. I'm kind of waiting for white to take me. This is what's known in chess as a position with like a lot of tension. I can take them, they can take me, I can take them, they can take me. You know, all of these pawns are kind of staring off at one another. And usually in chess, you don't really want to be the one to make the first capture unless you have a very good reason for doing so. Like here, for example, if I take the pawn on d4 or f4, I think they'll take back with their e-pawn, and then the rook is lining up towards my queen once those e-pawns are gone. So I'm not really in a rush to do that. I do need to do something about this pawn because they're attacking it 2 times. So I think I'm going to push the pawn up to e4, block this bishop out, and then develop my bishop to the a6 square, where it's going to kind of slice and dice through white's position pretty well. So they're playing pawn to h3. They might be trying to play g4. I'm not really 100% sure. I think what I'll do here... Let's see. I could play h5. H5 is actually not a bad move at all. Gain a little bit of space, stop them from playing g4. I think I might do this. When you have a big space advantage, usually what you also want to be very purposeful about doing is trying to restrict the opponent from the ideas that they want to execute on. So there's something that white wants to do in the position. If I can prevent them from doing it, that can make their task of playing the position more difficult. Okay, they play the move knight to d2. I'm assuming they're going to play some kind of b3 and bishop b2 is my guess. With that in mind, how do I want to play in this position? So the center of the board is relatively closed and locked up right now. Not 100% because there is this one pair of pawns facing off against one another, but mostly the center of the board is closed down. I still don't want to take them, and they don't really want to take me. So in a case like this where the center of the board is locked up a lot, usually the play is going to revolve around the edges of the board. And in that regard, I probably want to play more on the... I don't know. Do I want to play more on the queen side part of the board or more on the king side part of the board? You could kind of make an argument for both here, I think. The question is, if I'm going to play on the king side, how am I going to do that? If I'm going to play on the queen side, how am I going to do that? It's not an easy or obvious answer. I feel like if I'm going to play on the king side, it's probably going to revolve, or it's probably going to involve some kind of piece sacrifice at some point, quite honestly. Because the king side is kind of closed up for the most part. If I go h4, they'll go g4, you know, stuff like that. The queen side has a little bit more flexibility, you could call it. So I think I'm going to play on the queen side. I'm going to go for the move a5, gain some space, maybe a4. They play a4 themselves, okay? But now I'm thinking about the move c4. But then they might go b3. Okay, we're going to go bishop a6, and I think we're going to sink the bishop into the d3 square. And kind of see what happens here. So they're moving the knight. It's very solid play from white, but again, very passive, and I think we're going to have some pawn breaks on the queen side that will eventually open things up in our favor. So, With that being said, how am I going to do this? How am I going to do this? I'm not actually 100% sure. It's going to be some kind of slower methodical play. But how to do it? How to do it? I feel like my knight on d7 is kind of badly placed. Okay, I'm going to go for b5. I'm going to try to blast open the queen side at this point. If they take, I'm going to take with the bishop. And next, I'm going to try to probably shift a bit more over towards the queen side. They go for the move queen to b3. I think I can go bishop to c4. I can also go rook to b8. I think I'm going to go for this. Rook to b8, line up towards the queen. Bishop takes knight, followed by taking the queen is a big threat. He moves the queen right back, right back to d1. And next, I'm going to. How am I going to do this? Okay, we're going to sink the bishop into the d3 square. This is a very annoying location. And also now the bishop for white is tied down to protecting the b2 pawn. If they move this bishop, we'll take the pawn on b2. Next, we might play the move pawn to c4 to really lock the bishop in place. We might also maneuver the knight over towards the c4 square. So knight b6 and then knight to c4 is one way of doing things here for sure. So I think I'm going to go for that plan. If the knight's on c4, it's also attacking the b2 pawn, which is pretty useful. So the queen has to move somewhere. He might go right back to d1. I'm not sure. Okay, it goes right back to d1. But now I'm going to go for the move a4. If I go knight c4, he might play b3. So I'm going to play a4 just to lock this pawn in place. And then knight c4 to target the pawn on b2. And that's kind of the plan I'm working with here. So he plays b3. I'm going to take this pawn. I'm attacking his rook on a1. He takes with that rook. But now I can take with the knight, I believe. And I'm protecting the pawn on b3. And the goal is to push the pawn and try to promote it. That's the simple game plan here. Plays bishop to b2, but this doesn't stop me from pushing the pawn. And now he doesn't really have a way to stop me from promoting the pawn on b2, or on b1 here. And it's going to cost him at least a rook, if not more material. So he moves the queen away. I could promote right away. I could also take this knight first. I'm just going to promote, though, I think. And once he takes, I'll take back with the bishop. I want to keep my rook protecting my knight on a8. And now I'm just up an entire rook in this position. So next I'll put the bishop back on d3, trade more pieces, take on d4, open the position up. We're up a bunch of material with an extra rook. I have to play pretty quickly here, but the extra rook is going to win us the game. So we're going to go here, take stuff. Okay. Yeah, I'm just going to make the capture. And then let's lock things up. I could have also taken on d4, but okay, we're going to have the open file. We're going to offer the queen trade. The bishops are completely immobilized here, which is very bad for white. Let's go queen to d7 to offer a trade of queens. If white trades queens, we're obviously very happy. If they move the queen away, here I'll play bishop f8 to attack the queen. Move the rook into, or actually I guess we can move the queen in to attack the knight. We will eliminate this knight. Maneuver the knight to the b5 square, and then look to push our c pawn down the board. That's the game plan. Could also play rook takes b4 and give up a little bit of material. I think I'll just do that. We're going to give up a little bit of material, but we're still up one piece, and we'll work towards pushing the pawn. So knight to b5 here. Maneuver the knight into c3. Let's put the king on g7 just to avoid any checks on the back rank. Let's play knight to c3 to attack the bishop and bring the queen in. We give the check. We go here to attack the pawn on e3. Queen to d2 would have also worked as well. If he moves king f2, then I can check on d1. Okay, here we take with check. Here we can give a check. Bishop is going to block. Knight goes here. Queen takes g3. Queen to g1. These are the threats. And queen to g1 is the checkmate. I don't even need to take the queen on the d5 square here. Okay, got a little dicey with the time situation there at the end, but we get the job done. So let's go back through the game and analyze it. So d4, knight f6, e3, c5, c3. And so far, white's playing what is known as the Colley system, but then the move g3 kind of doesn't go together with the Colley system all that much. White's main move in this position is going to be the move bishop to d3. Against this, I recommend going knight to d7. They develop, g6, castle, develop, and then usually we will castle, move the queen, and we try to play the move e5. That's kind of what I went for in this game anyways, the main difference being that white's bishop was on the g2 square in the game instead of being on the d3 square. So the game version of things is pretty similar. Still knight d7, g6, bishop g7, castle, and then we go for the move e5. And black is already a little bit better off in the position, but it's definitely not a gigantic advantage. It's a more pleasant position with a space advantage, but it's not necessarily one where white's just completely lost or in huge trouble. White's got a very rock-solid position, but it is very passive at the same time. So they played knight to b3, attacking the pawn on c5. I play queen to e7 to protect it. If they do take the pawn, it is possible to take the pawn on d5 here, but it's also very risky at the same time. I think I would have played rook to d8, attacking the bishop and pinning it. Probably they play pawn to c4. And then here, I think I can go either bishop e6, or maybe I just go ahead and take the bishop here. And like white's going to have a lot of trouble with their kingside protection when they're missing their light square bishop. I am down a pawn, but I think that white's going to have some light square problems around the kingside that's going to be difficult to solve. So they didn't go for that. They went for the move rook e1 instead. We go rook d8, b6, e4, h5. And again, when you have a big space advantage, and this is something I'll talk more about in future videos, I am in the process right now of, I have created a course for Chessable that's in the beta testing phase right now. It's all about converting middle game advantages, like space advantages, bishop pair advantage, pawn weakness advantages, things like that. So that being said, part of that course will be about the topic of playing with a space advantage. When you have a space advantage in chess, it's very important to make sure that your center of the board is very well built up and very hard for the opponent to break down. We've done a pretty good job of that here. On the second thing is you want to try to restrict your opponent's counterplay and prevent them from doing what they want to do. You can kind of view a space advantage as being like a boa constrictor, where you're just trying to tighten the squeeze on your opponent, and that's the way that you could win these types of positions. So I saw that white might want to play g4. I don't know if it's the best idea, but I played h5 to stop it. And then we gain more space. We go for a pawn break that opens up the position. We line up towards the queen. We get our pieces to better squares. We get them to better squares. I didn't want to go knight c4 right away because I thought they would just kick my knight. So I played a4 first, and then I took. And then the big problem white ran into is now they're just down a pawn, and it's very hard to stop the pawn from advancing. Even if they do play bishop to b2, I think I would play pawn to c4, and then maneuver the knight to attack the bishop that's blocking the pawn. And white's in very bad shape here. Down a pawn, and the pass b pawn is very, very strong. In the game, they allowed us to push the pawn. We won the rook. And then we had to, play a bit quickly with the time element, but we eventually got the job done. We gave up a little bit of material to clarify the position, picked up a few pawns, and eventually got the checkmate. So that was it for this game. Let's go ahead and get into our next one. All right, let's get into our next one. We're playing against Domisek Konek. Definitely butchered that name there. So rated 1345 from the Czech Republic. So d4, knight f6. Let's see what they decide to go for on the second move of the game. They do go for a London system, so we've seen this with bishop f4 quite a few times in the Speedrun series. We're going for the move c5, striking against our opponent's center. This is our typical move on the second move of the game. We've seen a couple of opponents take on c5. We've seen some e3s. I think we've seen some c3s. I think a higher level e3 is probably the most popular move. I do think d5 is objectively the best move, but it's also very uncommon and very rare. Most people who play the London system aren't really used to pushing their pawn up to the d5 square. Here, our opponent goes for the move knight to c3, and the downside of the knight going to the c3 square is that it doesn't really do a whole lot to deal with our capture on d4 in this position. We can now take on d4, force white to recapture with their queen, and once the queen recaptures on d4, we can start to harass the queen pretty easily with moves like knight c6. So I think we're just going to go ahead and make the capture, and then we'll develop and hit the queen. Queen's going to have to move away somewhere. d3 is probably the most solid square. a4 is also relatively decent as well. They decide to go to d2. I don't think this is all that bad either. The one slight issue white can run into with the queen on d2, along with the knight on c3 and the king on e1, is maybe one day a bishop on b4 pin can be quite annoying, since it lines up with kind of all three of these pieces that white has in the position. So I could consider playing e5 and trying to make the pin once the bishop moves. However, if I go for e5 and white plays bishop g5, I'm always going to have some slight issues with my d5 square. If I go bishop to b4, white could even just take the knight on f6 and then, try to win the battle for the d5 square. So I have to be a little bit careful about that. I'm not that worried about any knight b5 jumps just yet, because I do still have kind of the e5 move as a resource. So I'm probably going to play d5 here, quite honestly. I want to play d5, then e5. Again, if I go for e5 first, they pin, then d5. The difference is in that move order, they can eliminate my knight and then take my pawn in the center. If I start with d5, again, knight b5 isn't a problem because I can push to e5. And otherwise, I can maybe go pawn to d4, e5, stuff like that. So that's what I'm leaning towards. I think it is also entirely possible to just continue with a more, I don't want to call it passive, but like a little bit more of a less ambitious setup, if you want to put it that way, with g6 and bishop g7. The slight drawback to that arrangement of things, though, is that maybe white can play the move bishop h6 at the right time, and that kind of makes life a little bit difficult because my fianchetted bishop gets traded off. So I'm going to go with the move d5. This is the one I'm leaning towards at this rate. d4 ideas, e5 ideas. That's what I'm kind of angling for here. I may throw in the move a6 at the right time if I really need to prevent the knight from jumping to the b5 square, but I don't think that's too big of a concern just yet. Again, knight to b5, we have the move e5. You do always have to be careful about these bishop f4, knight on c3. Like, when these knight to b5 jumps become possible, then there's always a little bit of shakiness you have to be careful about there. So my opponent decides to castle queenside. I don't think this really does a whole lot about my idea of pushing with e5 and d4. I do have to figure out the correct sequence of moves. If I go for e5 first, they pin, then I go d4. It is maybe an idea at the right time for them to hop into the e4 square, even though I don't think it would be available in that specific circumstance, because we could actually take the knight on e4 and attack the queen that's on d2. So I don't know if the move order here matters that much. I think I'm going to go for the e5 move order just to set, I don't want to say, I guess in some regards it's setting a little bit of a trap. I think both move orders are good, but I'm going to go for the e5 move order. And if white goes bishop g5, I will go for d4. And they might play this knight e4 mistake. They might also take the knight first and then play knight e4. That would also be generally fine with me as well. So white needs to move the bishop. That's the biggest threat in the position for sure. Oops, sorry. And then, yeah, regardless of where they move the bishop away to, we're going to play the move d4 next. That's the game plan. It is also important to note that my queen on d8 is protected by my knight on c6. So why that's important is because if I ever do play d4, I am actually legitimately threatening to take the knight, because the queen and rook, if white tries to take my queen on d8, supported by the rook, I do have knight takes d8. If my knight was not on c6, then I would not actually be threatening to take the knight on c3, because my queen would be a big problem there. So white goes bishop g5. I am going to follow up with d4. Not only because I want to hit the knight, but also because white was threatening to eliminate my knight followed by winning my pawn. So I do need to deal with that threat. And yeah, right now the threat is to take the knight. Knight e4, I will take the knight and then attack their queen. So it doesn't really matter that my knight's pinned if I can attack their queen in the process. If they take my knight, I will probably take back with the pawn, quite honestly. I'll explain that a little bit more if that's what they go for. The safest move very well may be some kind of knight b1 in this position, which doesn't really look all that great, quite honestly, but at least it doesn't seem to get white into immediate, like, huge trouble. So going back to b1 might be the safest move. Knight to a4, I think I can play b5 and trap the knight on the edge of the board. So, okay, they do decide to eliminate my knight. As I said a moment ago, I'm leaning towards taking with the pawn. I can't take the knight right now because my own queen would be captured a number of different ways. I'd actually get checkmated with queen takes d8, knight takes d8, rook takes d8, checkmate, so we can't take there. So we have to take the bishop, and the option is with the pawn or the queen. Taking with the queen seems, let's say, like, strategically better because I don't end up with doubled pawns. However, the drawback to taking with the queen is the knight does get to centralize somewhere and attack my queen in the process. And then I have to move the queen a second time, and white kind of gets sort of a free move of putting the knight in the center where I have to react to what they're doing. If I take with the pawn instead, first of all, they can't go to d5 anymore because I cover that square. Second of all, whenever they do move the knight, probably to the e4 square, then my queen is not on f6 being attacked, and I have a free move to attack white in some way. So maybe I would go bishop e6, attack the pawn on a2, rook to c8. I can kind of start this attack on their queen side quicker than normal. Let's put it that way. So I'm going to take with the pawn. This also even opens up some bishop h6 ideas at the right time, but that's not really something I'm looking to do just yet because they would just take the bishop on h6. So I'm assuming the knight goes into the e4 square, and then I'm probably following up with bishop to e6 to attack a2, swing the rook over, put the knight on b4, and I'm really just going to try to attack white's queenside ASAP. And I can always decide when to develop the dark square bishop. It might want to go to h6, it might want to go to b4, different ideas like that. Queen to d5 here would be a nice fork, attacking the knight and the pawn, but my queen is needed to protect the pawn on f6. If I go queen d5, then knight takes f6 would check my king and attack my queen, which would be very, very bad. We would lose the queen there. So I am going to go for bishop to e6. I think that white's best plan in this kind of position is they really need to play moves like e3 or c3. c3 is going to be pretty risky, so they probably need to play e3 here. But if they play e3, I can maybe throw in bishop h6 just to pin the pawn and set up a lot of trouble on that lineup. And I can, I have this big space advantage. I have relatively active pieces. White's pieces on the king side specifically are going to take a while to get in the game. And I can go for a very fast attack, I think, in this kind of position. I can play rook c8, knight b4, hit the a2 pawn, queen a5, queen b6, bishop b4. Just lots of moves are possible over on this queen side half of the board. And I don't think I need to worry too much about my king being in the center because it's pretty well protected behind all of these pawns in the middle of the board. I really don't see how white attacks me in this position. So they do play e3. I was thinking that this is probably their best move. It does also open up the bishop at the same time. So I think I am going to throw in the move bishop h6. I don't know if it's strictly necessary, but I do like the idea of pinning this pawn and making it more difficult for white to put pressure on my center. One of white's ideas is to maybe take the pawn on d4 or to pin my knight and then take the pawn. When you're behind on space in the center of the board like white is here, you really need to try to counterattack your opponent's center. And I think that's why I was thinking that e3 was probably the best move. So, yeah, I'm leaning towards bishop h6. Bishop e7 and just playing it solidly in the center also looks quite good, I will say. But I think I'm going to go for bishop h6. I want to pin this pawn. Not only is the pawn pinned, but even if the queen moved away, it's pinned kind of a second time since the king is also on c1. I may even capture the pawn on e3 in some circumstances. Like, maybe right now is not a terrible scenario to do it, quite honestly. I do have the pair of bishops, so the more the position opens up, the happier my bishops are going to be. One thing I did kind of neglect to think about here is there is now the possibility of knight to c5. This could actually be kind of annoying at the right time, because now my pawn on b7 is undefended and my bishop is no longer covering the c5 square. So I think what I'm going to do here, let's see. I'm thinking about the move queen to b6, maybe? I'm not sure. I mean, queen to b6 threatens to take the pawn on e3, and it also threatens the bishop at the same time. It does allow white to take on f6 with check, but after my king moves up, then the knight is attacked, the bishop is attacked, and the e3 pawn's attacked. That's actually a lot of things that white has to deal with very quickly. And I think the king on e7 is relatively safe there, I will say. And maybe I can even castle queenside if given the opportunity. So I think I'm going to do this. There is definitely some risk associated with this, but if I do get to castle queenside, then I think it's just a terrible position for white. My king is going to be pretty safe on the queen side. Okay, he decides to take on c6. I'm going to take back with the queen to attack the knight. And it's a situation where if they take on f6 with check and my king moves up, the knight actually has no good squares to retreat to. He'd have to go back to h5, and then I think I might be able to take the g2 pawn. So, yeah, I'm going to take here and hit the knight. And if he does take the pawn. I'm moving the king up here. And I was going to say, he pretty much has to play knight h5 in this position. It's the only safe move. My bishop covers g4 and my queen covers e4. And if he had played knight h5, I think I had, a capture of the g2 pawn. Maybe bishop to g4 was also a tactic. But he decides to go to g4, which, simply put, just doesn't work as far as I can tell. We can just take the knight, and we are now just up a piece. They are throwing in a check. It's not a fork, though. I mean, my pawn is in the way. And they're still not really threatening to take the pawn since it's the e3 pawn is pinned. I don't really want to play queen d6. They can take on b7. I guess I could retreat the bishop and then maybe try to, trap the queen or trade queens. Maybe that's not all that bad, quite honestly. As weird as it looks, I'm thinking about king f6 here. I think I'm going to do this. So king f6 looks incredibly weird. But first of all, there's really no way to hit the king. And second of all, I didn't really want to block the bishop. And third of all, I didn't really want to block the rooks. So I kind of put the king on a relatively safe location. And I'm going to continue attacking now. So rook to c8 is my idea. I think I'll use the h8 rook just to... I don't know. Let's use the a8 rook. I'm threatening to take on c2 with checkmate. I could also take the pawn on g2 pretty much at any moment, and then the rook on h1 would be trapped. I do kind of want to keep the queen a little bit close to the king, though. If I take on g2, maybe there's some check on d6. They play pawn to c3. Yeah, I could take on g2. I think I'm going to not do that, though. I'm going to go bishop to f5. I'm kind of retaining the option of taking on g2, but I'm mainly just focusing on everything on the queen side first. So now I attack the rook moves away. I can now take the pawn on e3 or c3. I think I'm going to take on... Ooh, sorry. I do not want to take on e3. There is a check on d6. Also, if I take on c3, there's a check on d6. So I'm going to play rook to d8. And then next I'm going to take the e3 or c3 pawns. They're both still pinned. There's not really much white can do to avoid losing one of these two. I have to play quite a bit quicker due to time, but we're up 2 pawns. Or not 2 pawns. We're up the exchange in this position. Actually, sorry. We're up a piece for a pawn in this position. And we're going to pick up an additional pawn or 2 and really just look to, gain more material and win from here. So he moves the knight. We take on e3. If he takes on d8, we will take back with the rook. Could have also played, quite honestly, I could have also played queen to e4. Queen e4 would have actually been quite strong. Here I'm taking on f2 with a discovered check. And the problem for white here is their king has no escape squares. And we don't even need to take the rook. We can actually just promote to a queen, and we get the checkmate. So cutting it close with the time here. I generally, with these games, I'm not playing with increment. I'm playing just 10 minutes with 0 seconds increment. That does get us into some dicey time situations occasionally, but I think it's the 10-0 rating pool, let's put it that way, I think is representative of what a lot of people are playing. A lot of people are playing 10-0 in the rapid pool on chess.com. I may add increment once I start facing tougher opponents, who knows, but for now I'm going to continue playing with the 10-0 time control. Anyways, though, we get a pretty nice checkmate here. Let's go back and analyze the game. So d4, knight f6, bishop f4, we get into a London system, but this move knight c3 is really not all that good. I think white's kind of trying to play a Jobava London type of situation, but if they're going to play that, they really should start with knight c3 first, hinting at the idea of playing e4. As I've talked about, I think in previous games where the opponents played knight c3, I don't recommend playing d5 in this position. I don't recommend playing c5 in this position because white will play d5 and e4, and they'll just get all the space in the center. I recommend going d5 here, and then they might go bishop f4. Then I would go c5. This is my recommendation. And then here white has different options that are available, but switching the moves around in the game runs them into the problem of their queen getting harassed, and then us just getting a big space advantage as we saw in the center. So we get to play d5, we get to play e5, we get to play d4. We're just rolling the pawns down the center of the board. White took on f6, we take back with the pawn. Bishop e6 may not be the best move. Maybe in hindsight, maybe I should just be playing f5. I didn't really think about this during the game all that much, but this also looks very, very reasonable. If the knight goes back to g3, we might even be able to just continue barreling forward, quite honestly. And this is a trapped knight. So maybe in hindsight, yeah, like f5, I didn't actually think about during the game for whatever reason, but this is kind of a funny situation where you're able to trap the opponent's knight in the center of the board because you have such a big space advantage. The knight simply has no escape squares, and we would win the piece. So in hindsight, that would have been a lot better. But okay, bishop e6 was played, bishop h6, queen to b6. I think all of this was pretty good. As I mentioned during the game, if you had taken on f6 right away, I would move the king. And there's just a lot of things being attacked in white's position. If they take on c6, we would take back, let's see, I don't know. Maybe I would even take on f6 with the king and then take the pawn. Maybe I would take this way and then take this pawn. I guess they have check on d6. That would be very bad. Yeah, maybe if they took this way, I would, I don't know, take with the king and then take on e3, and white's in very, very bad shape in this position for sure. Anyways, though, they took on c6 first, took with the queen. Taking this pawn ends up being quite risky. I think he has to play knight h5 at this rate. It's really the only safe move. And I wasn't sure if I was going to play bishop g4 or queen takes g2. Both of these look like they pick up material. Bishop g4 attacks the knight, attacks the rook, and it looks like we're just winning something here. Queen takes g2 also looks quite good. Maybe knight e2, and I don't know, maybe this is not actually the end of the world for white because our pieces are very badly developed. He also has queen to b4 check, which continues to be an annoying move. Maybe another option is, again, not to go greedy on the king side, but maybe I should just be playing something like rook to c8 and prioritizing the queen side part of the board, since that's where I have a lot of pieces aiming. But anyways, in the game they play knight g4. That obviously is a big blunder. I just get to pick up the knight for free. And then I move the king away, threaten checkmate, hit the rook, line up on the d file. I was actually very close to making, I think, a huge blunder here with taking on the e3 or c3. I almost completely missed that white has this move rook to d6 check available. This may actually not be the end of the world, quite honestly. Like, if we move the king, they get the queen. But here we can actually take on f2 or even play pawn to e2 And yeah, it's another situation where white's actually going to get themselves checkmated because we're making a queen next move. They block with the pawn, and then this is actually checkmate. So maybe it actually would be fine for us to take the e3 pawn and not worry about rook d6 check. I decided to play it kind of safe, especially with the time situation ticking down. I played rook to d8, then I took on e3, recaptured. I think I maybe could have taken on f2 first, but okay, this all ends up being good, and yeah, white essentially gets themselves checkmated in this position. So I think we start off with a very large advantage, then kind of miss this opportunity to play f5 and f4 and trap the knight in the center of the board. I think white did create some counterplay, which I probably shouldn't have allowed, but ultimately we got the win. We got a nice attack on the queen side and got the checkmate later in the game. So that'll do it for this game. Let's get into our third and final one. All right, so we've got our third game here, playing against Tony Abrihan, rated 1405 from Romania. So they start off with d4, we go knight f6, they go knight f3. Against this, I recommend playing the move pawn to c5, just kind of sticking with our kind of Benko-esque approach. Even though the pawn wasn't on d5 just yet, even though the pawn wasn't on c4 just yet, we can still play the move c5, attack the opponent's center. So white goes for the move pawn to d5. And normally in a kind of, let's say, pure Benko Gambit, white would already have the pawn on c4, and we would be going for the move b5, looking to sacrifice the pawn and open up the queen side. In this particular case, because the pawn's not on c4 yet, if we do play the move b5, it's no longer coming with a kind of offer of a gambit. But nonetheless, I still recommend going for the move pawn to b5 when the opponent has advanced the pawn up to d5 in this particular case. So they go for the move g3. And here we can probably start to put a bit of pressure on this pawn that's on the d5 square. We can go bishop to b7 to attack the pawn. That's definitely a possibility. It's also possible to just continue with g6, bishop g7, and castle. That's also a perfectly good way of playing the position too. I think I'm going to go for the g6 route. If you go bishop b7, the best move there is probably to play the move c4 anyways. And if we take on c4, they can then play the move knight to c3 to reinforce the pawn. And that's probably a perfectly fine position for black, but I'm not usually a huge fan of having the bishop be stuck on the b7 square when white's able to reinforce the d5 pawn, even if it comes at the cost potentially of white maybe even losing the c4 pawn for a little bit. So I'm going to go with the move g6, put the bishop on g7, probably play pawn to d6 at some point here as well. If they go bishop g2, maybe then I'll just play d6 real quick. Bishop g7 also is fine here. The one thing I have to be a little bit careful about when the bishop is on g2 and we've moved our pawn to b5 is maybe white could play a move like pawn to d6 to open up the diagonal at some point. So we have to be just a little bit careful about that. I don't think it's a concern yet, though, because even if white does push the pawn, we can always answer that with bishop to b7. So I think we're just going to continue with bishop g7. They do go for d6, so I do have to be careful about this lineup. The main issue is they're threatening to move the knight away somewhere, and that would open up the attack on the rook. So, for example, if I take the pawn, I think even knight e5 there could be kind of annoying with the threat on the rook in the corner. And I have to block the diagonal with something to avoid losing the rook. And then whatever I block with, white's going to be able to capture it. So I think the simplest answer here is probably just to go with the move bishop to b7. We kind of line up with their bishop on g2. And then next move, we'll castle. If they ever take our pawn on e7, we'll just recapture. That's not really a big deal. We can also play a move like knight to e4 at the right time to put some pressure on the d6 pawn. I'm going to castle first, though. And if white does nothing here, maybe we'll take the pawn, they take back, and then knight to e4, we'll put some pressure on them. So they go for the move knight to c3. They are attacking the pawn on b5. If I go pawn to b4 attacking the knight, they might jump forward with knight to b5. And that becomes quite annoying, I will say, because I really don't want the knight to end up on d6. I don't mind if a queen is on d6 because I can kick the queen around, but knight on d6 would be quite annoying. So I think in that regard, I'm actually going to play the move pawn to a6 first. I might play pawn to b4 next, now that I've got the b5 square covered. And they play pawn to e4, which is kind of a surprising move. It is entirely possible for us to capture the pawn right now. I don't think there's anything wrong with that as far as I'm aware. We could also play pawn to b4 first to kick the knight away from protecting the pawn. That might be even better. So let's see. What are we going to do here? The only thing I have to be a little bit careful at with winning the pawn in the center is maybe white plays a move like rook e1 and lines up towards this pawn on e7. The capture on e7 could still be kind of annoying for us. So I think what I'm going to do is I think I'm going to take the pawn first. And then if white recaptures with the queen, then I think I'm going to play pawn to b4 to attack this knight. And then once the knight moves away, I can take the pawn, attack the queen, and protect the c5 pawn at the same time. I think that's the move order I'm going to go for. So I think we'll do it this way. We take this, and then we play pawn to b4. Yeah, I think we'll do it this way. If the knight goes into the d5 square, I think we can take the pawn on e4 in that position. So we can take the pawn on e4. And the queen is actually kind of running low on squares. The queen needs to keep the knight on d5 protected. And so I think here we're guarding the pawn, hitting the queen. If the queen moves away to these squares, we can take the knight. So white probably has to throw in the check here. But after we move the king, I don't think white's able to keep the knight on e7 protected. And I think that white's actually just going to lose material. So we move the king away, the queen is still being hit, and the pawn is still defended, and the knight is still being attacked at the same time. And the queen can retreat to safety. That saves the queen, but that doesn't really save the knight. And so I think here we're going to pick up the knight. There's nowhere the queen can move away to also keep the knight defended. So I think white realizes that they're going to lose the piece. They decide to get kind of a pawn in return for it, which is a reasonable idea. I'm going to take back with the f pawn to open up my rook. And we're still attacking the queen on d6. So they still need to retreat the queen. They go all the way back to the d1 square. But at this point, we are up a piece. I think the simplest thing to do is just to expand in the center. Let's go d5 and grab more space. Develop the knight, improve the queen. Pawn to c3 doesn't look very safe. I think we can just take the pawn in this position. And then I don't know if you want to take with the bishop or take with the knight. Leaning towards taking with the knight to hit the queen. And then maybe we can play a move like knight e2 check right here. Queen takes the knight, bishop takes the rook. And I think in that situation, we will be in good shape. There are some tricks, I suppose, that white could have there. Like if we check, they take, we get the rook. They could play bishop h6. That does attack the rook on f8 and open up the attack on our bishop on a1. And if we retreat the bishop to g7 to block that off, white can trade the bishops and then swing the queen over to b2, which would check our king and hit the bishop on b7. So I think instead of getting fancy here, quite honestly, I think I'm just going to develop a new piece. Retain this option. It's kind of in the air. But otherwise, maybe even a move like knight to b4 and continue harassing the queen. Maybe pawn to d4 and guard the knight is also an idea. Yeah, I'm going to go knight to, let's say, b4. Yeah, I think we'll just do this. Attack the queen. Probably the queen goes to d2. Then I'm going to play the move d4 just to secure the knight on c3. Okay, they go queen to b3 instead. But here I think I can... I think I can check first. King moves. And then I think I'm going to go pawn to d4. And I'm opening up some pressure on this knight that's on f3. I'm also avoiding this trade of bishops. I kind of want to keep the bishop on g7 alive. It is kind of the only piece keeping my king safe. White plays rook to d1. I think here, though, I can go bishop to d5. Yeah, I think we'll go bishop d5 attacking the queen. And the queen needs to keep the knight on f3 protected. So I think queen to a3 is kind of mandatory. They go to a4, but this doesn't save the knight on f3. I think we can just take the knight on f3 at this point. So we capture this knight, pick up an extra piece. Now we're going to be ahead 2 pieces instead of just 1. And also now that we're trading off the bishop on g2, white's king is going to be a lot less safe. We can do something like queen to d5 and line up towards the queen, which is very dangerous for them. So I think we can just set up that threat. Yeah, I guess we'll just go here. We're lining up towards the king. Rook takes f2 is a checkmate threat. And if the king moves forward, we have a bunch of different discovered checks available. There's really no way white can avoid the discovered checks. And they're going to probably be checkmated very quickly here. Aside from the checkmate, we're also up 2 pieces with a very big advantage. Okay, they do free up a safe square for the king, but rook takes f2 is still checkmate. It's not even a safe square. The rook on f2 protects the h2 square, and we do get the checkmate. Okay, so that's that game. Let's analyze it here. So d4, knight f6, knight f3, c5, d5, b5. There's a full chapter in the course that's devoted to this d5, b5 situation where white has not put the pawn on c4 just yet. Pawn to g3 is one of the, I'd say, relatively rare lines. At a higher level, the best moves for white are bishop to g5, pawn to c4, and I think pawn to e4 is also an interesting kind of gambit that white can do themselves. I think pawn to e4 has been played by a number of grandmasters. If they go pawn to c4 here, I recommend the move pawn to b4, which kind of turns it into a Benko Gambit decline type of position. But black is pretty happy with the space advantage on the queen side, and white also has a little bit of a trickier time developing the b1 knight since we covered the c3 and a3 squares. So g3 is what white went for. Also point out, if they go bishop g5, I recommend going g6 and bishop g7 here, and black is also fine at this point. Against g3, I just decided to go g6. If we try to go bishop to b7, I thought white would go pawn to c4. We can take the pawn, they protect it. And usually I'm not a huge fan of these positions where the bishop gets kind of stuck on the b7 square behind the d5 pawn. Probably black is okay at this point, but I'd kind of rather avoid those situations. Okay, so here in this case, though, my opponent goes for the move bishop to g2. We continue with bishop to g7. And they go for this d6 move, which does open up the diagonal towards the rook on a8. But we're not really all that concerned about this because we can block that diagonal with our bishop. And as the game progressed, I think white is playing totally fine here so far. The move e4 was actually very interesting. I do think their main mistake comes here with this queen takes d6 move, which doesn't really work that well, because once we kick the knight away from c3 and then pick up the pawn, then white's down material at this point. I think what they should go for here is maybe bishop to f4, and maybe try to recapture the pawn on d6 with the bishop, which is probably a bit more dangerous than capturing with the queen, but it's a little bit hard to tell. These positions when the pawn is on d6 are always a little bit tricky for both players to navigate. I think here, though, that after we attack the knight and then pick up this pawn, especially when the knight goes into the center, there's going to be it's going to be very hard for white to hold this knight on d5 in place. If the queen moves away, we are going to capture the knight for free. And even though they made the check, again, if the queen moves backwards, we take the knight and we are up a piece. So we eventually won the piece, gained more space, picked up an additional pawn, eventually won another piece on f3. And then once we were ahead the 2 pieces, they eventually got checkmated. So definitely an interesting game. Not a full-blown Benko Gambit, but one of the more mainline approaches out of all the games we've had in the speedrun so far. The knight f3, c5, d5 move from our opponent is a very important move to know what to do against it. And so hopefully you got some ideas from it in this particular game. So that'll do it for this game and for this episode. Hopefully you enjoyed the 3 games we took a look at during this video here. I will get back with you guys in a future video to continue the speedrun. See you in the next one.